If you're a caregiver looking to implement your own floor time approach, please see the Parents menu at icdl.com, the Interdisciplinary Council on Development and Learning, for the virtual floor time consultations for parents. There you can schedule an appointment, look at the virtual DIR home program services, and see the weekly parent support meetings registration. We aim to help you implement the developmental individual differences relationship-based model at home, taking into account where your child is developmentally and their individual sensory processing differences within your safe and nurturing relationship to promote and support their developmental potential. You're listening to Affect Autism, where affect is the #1 tool we use in supporting child development through playful interactions. Hello, welcome back, listeners. I'm Daria Brown, and I have with me this week returning guest psychologist Kathy Platzman from Floor Time Atlanta. And we are going to be discussing something that's been on my mind a lot lately. More I read of self-advocates on Twitter, the more blog posts I read of autistic self-advocates, the more I think, I'm just like that. And then I did podcasts with Maud LaRue and Mike Fields about ADHD. And then Joanne and Millie, and Joanne said she has ADHD. And I'm like, I have those things too. And so while Maud said, oh, it's like Psych 101, we read about all the different psychological disorders and we say, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me. You never know what is true, what isn't. And I thought, who better to ponder this with than a clinical psychologist, Kathy Platzman. So welcome back, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Daria. It's always good to be here. So you've come up with another good question for me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just the grand question that jumps out to me is, seemingly, I never had challenges growing up. I always felt different than all the other kids, but as far as I know, I didn't have motor planning challenges. I didn't really have regulation issues, although I might as an adult. But, you know, it just was a pretty typical childhood, I think. Yet, I read all of these things about the way people process, and the more neurodivergent people with diagnoses that I interact with who have all been ADHD, not necessarily autistic, the more I think, oh my goodness, like this person and I get each other in a way that I haven't felt with normal people in my life. And I realize, like, I think I'm a bit neurodivergent, which wouldn't be crazy because my son, oh, and crazy isn't the right word either, because I'm learning now from the self-advocates about language that we use and, you know, terms,
yeah, me too.
Terms that are not appropriate to use anymore. But it's not far-fetched, shall I say,
sure, that
my son, who is autistic, whose personality is exactly like mine, got some traits from me. So let's dive in, and why don't you let us know what your experience is and how you help navigate that with parents. Is there a point of getting any kind of diagnosis for parents that think they are? What would be the value of that or not? Right. And anything else that comes up.
Well, okay, let's just kick this can down the road and see where it lands, right? First of all, it's a really good question. We are dealing with neurodivergence all the time. To some extent, neurodiversity is defined by the culture, not by the nervous system, because some historical epochs, some different societies are tolerant for different things. My father was born in 1909, and he literally went to school in a little red schoolhouse. And I used to ask him, Dad, what would happen to a kid with ADHD? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, would a kid like that have problems in school? Did you have problems in school like that? And he kept saying, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? And then finally he said, are you asking, did the teacher kick him out of the classroom? And I said, I guess, Dad. And he goes, well, we just didn't see the problem. If you couldn't pay attention, you left that day and you went and worked on a farm. There was no problem. What are you talking about, you know? So that tells me that an historical epoch can have a lot to do with whether somebody has a neurodivergence. We were talking before the podcast about different cultures will tolerate different things at different times. So again, part of this is culturally determined, and of course, part of it is you inherit your parents' nervous systems just as surely as you inherit their eye color, their skin color. So oftentimes we hear our children struggle with things that we struggled with, but somebody might have a diagnosis and somebody might not. And it's that diagnosis piece, I think, that you were originally kind of, it's so interesting, right? To see another thing that runs in families is just, you look at somebody has a bipolar disorder, somebody has autism in the family, somebody has a really tough case of ADHD, somebody's got a mood disorder, and you think, are these all different manifestations of exactly the same nervous system? You know, it's a good question. And so when parents want to know, should I get diagnosed? Would that give me any help? Would that give me relief? It's a really good question. Again, it's just a kick around question to see. I'm glad I'm a DIR person though, because I don't get overwhelmed with that kind of question. In fact, it's a question we deal with every single day. The outward another complication. The outward manifestations of something doesn't mean that you are that at the root. You know, that would be the one person has bipolar in the family and another person has autism. So we have different solutions to our nervous systems, and we share those oftentimes as a family. Sometimes we really have sympathy for our children, and sometimes we say, I got over it, why can't you? Those things will happen sometimes. So let's think about that a little bit more. When you go ahead and see a nervous system that might not be having a good time in this society during this historical epoch in this particular culture, there are a lot of complications. First of all, we're dealing with something that's developmental, not acquired. You were born this way, you had this wiring, and this wiring did well in this environment and not well in another environment. That's an interesting way to look at it. So it's the way you're wired, and the environment can either support or irritate who you are, right? So oftentimes you will hit a wall. You won't be ADD. Nobody ever thought you had an attention problem until you went to school. Or nobody ever thought there was any problem until you got married. And so a lot of times we can really, we get all this funny static as a clinician, all this information, and we don't know how to make peace with it. We don't know how to put it in order or anything like that. But we will often hear that a kid does well on vacation and doesn't do well when they come home. They do well at school, but they don't do well at church. They did fine as a child, but then as an adolescent, they didn't do very well. And so we have a lot that we need to take in. So thank heavens the DIR model can actually take in all of this stuff. Sometimes when you want to know if you have a diagnosis, you want a doctor to give you a medicine. You know, if the Ritalin works, does that mean I'm ADHD? And of course, as a psychologist, we boo-hoo all that stuff. We don't like people doing backwards engineering on all this stuff. But on the other hand, sometimes that's one of the little pieces of data that we have. The problem with ADHD and medication is psychostimulants, which are usually the first choice. They help everybody. What do you think I'm drinking right now? I'm drinking coffee, right? So that's a psychostimulant. Do I have ADHD? Well, I don't know, but coffee makes me feel better. That's not very satisfying to people who are really trying to figure out what their kids inherited from them and why a particular thing is so difficult for them and nobody else. So you have to have a game plan, not just try the medication and see if it works, to see what you really have and how you can stay organized as you're figuring it out. Well, go ahead.
That resonates with me because, again, the goal of this podcast is not to diagnose me or me to think I'm diagnosing myself, but just to give an example, the environment that I grew up in, I really excelled at school. It was easy for me. I was the teacher's pet every year, all through grade school, high school. I was involved in activities. maybe in a different environment, that wouldn't have been the case. And for example, when I went into university, I struggled because it wasn't that small classroom nurturing environment. All of a sudden, it was 300 kids and you had to study on your own. And I never had to study in grade school or high school ever. I just did really well, picked up stuff, really good memory, like my son, who remembers every detail of everything. I remembered everything and I was able to regurgitate it. All of a sudden, you have to start to think in university and you really have to know how to learn. And I really struggled with that. And I juggled majors a bunch of times until psychology resonated with me. And I ended up doing a master's in personality psychology. Why? Maybe because I was trying to figure out who I was. But in different environments, the opposite can happen. And we hear about that all of the time too, how, and you gave a few examples of that. So it's that definitely resonates with me. And the other thing you said that I thought was really interesting made me think of not only that, but who you interact with. So
Yeah.
think about kids maybe who have foster parents and get juggled from house to house or whatever. Maybe different, well, it's sort of like the cultural context that you gave the example of, like in this household things worked, in this household it didn't. But the siblings, like people clash with other people. Different, you mentioned you don't notice it till you get married. Well, people that have multiple marriages, maybe in that first relationship, there was just a struggle because the interactions were setting off each other's nervous systems versus another interaction where they calmed each other's nervous systems or whatever. So there's so many different factors. It's like, you know,
Absolutely.
it's the way life is. Factors,
Plus,
unknown variables everywhere,
well, the other
constantly
variable,
changing.
that's the problem, constantly changing. Time also, guess what we do as we grow? Our nervous systems mature. So we can have a real easy elementary school, and then hormones hit and your adolescence hits and you unravel a lot of these things. There's even another complication, and that is a lot of these diagnoses are what we call shadow diagnoses, which means we think we're looking at the problem, but what we're looking at is a shadow of the problem. ADHD is the most popular diagnosis. It's the most often given diagnosis, psychiatric diagnosis. The reason is it's a shadow. Oftentimes, you can have ADHD, but oftentimes it's an add-on. You get it for free. It comes with, it comes with OCD. It comes with depression. It comes with anxiety. It comes with learning disabilities. It comes with global delays. It comes with language problems. It comes with motor problems. It comes with emotional problems. I mean, the day we have a big disappointment, the dog passes away, something unusual happens, you have a trauma. Oh, I can't concentrate. I can't remember anything. What'd you just say? We find ourselves having symptoms of ADHD, but they may be shadows of what the real problem is. So again, going back to that, that model that we love is really the most calming thing. I think it was a 0 to 3 publication. It's now 0 to 5 or 0 to 8, I don't know. But years ago, there was a diagnosis that you could give called multi-system developmental disorder, MSDD. And it boiled down to, sometimes you can have an individual difference that's so big, it makes you look autistic, for example. And if you fix the thing, that one little thing that you've got such a severe problem in, you lose your diagnosis, which was hopeful. It's hopeful because people oftentimes want life to get easier and easier and easier for kids, not harder and harder and harder. So that I wish we still had the ability to give that diagnosis, which is really a wait and see diagnosis while we work really hard with our young children. But anyway, that's the way of the world. Now the diagnostic world, that culture has changed again. But the DIR model has not. So I look to the DIR model for a game plan to help parents figure out what their diagnoses might be, what in the family is the neurodiversity. It's almost like feeling like you're doing a crossword puzzle or like you're Sherlock Holmes or, the game is on, let's figure this out. It's a lot of fun. So if you look at the DIR model and you remember that what the functional emotional developmental capacities is the core of development, that is relating to others, communicating with others, reasoning and thinking. If that's the bottom line for us, let's remember that and look at those especially the first developmental level, the ability to stay calm, focused, alert, while taking in information through all sensory modalities and staying at least vaguely connected to somebody while you're doing that stuff. That is the stuff that if you've got ADD, if you've got anything, again, that first developmental capacity gets shaky. A lot of trauma models these days and a lot of psychological models are wising up to the fact that if you can't be calm and focused and alert, nothing good happens after that. So a lot of our therapeutic models, I'm very happy to say, are shifting towards calming the body, calming the mind, then see what you have left. So oftentimes when we see a child or an adult who has real regulation difficulties in one of the big three areas, attention, behavior, or mood, we get very interested in just fixing that capacity and then see what you have. That's called going beyond the diagnosis, right? Let's really just look at those functional emotional capacities. If we find one that is tough, that's suffering, that needs some support, well, then we go to the I for the why, Well, why are you having difficulty staying calm, focused, and alert while taking in information and staying connected to people? And so when we begin this hunt in the DIR model, what we have to do is say, accept that this is going to take a while to figure out. Just accept that fact and enjoy the journey. Enjoy noticing and coming in and saying, this works for me when I go to when I'm studying math. My child doesn't have any ADHD problems in math, but man, anytime it's language focused, I start hearing, why can't he pay attention? Okay, we'll write down maybe an individual difference that way. The way to think about individual differences too might help parents slow down, slow their roll, as we like to say. What is your nervous system really doing for you? It's shuffling incoming information so that through all the senses. It has to shuffle it so that you know what to pay attention to and what to ignore. Well, that's a very difficult thing. And so if you can't shuffle correctly, you have to ask why. The journey of information in, maybe everything's getting in, but you can't shuffle it. You can't remember it. You can't integrate it. Maybe on one day you can and one day you can't. All that stuff helps us. So if you start looking at the D as constricted possibly in the first developmental capacity or all the way through, actually, just get an idea of what those functional capacities are. Then ask, why is that struggling? Why is that constricted in what contexts and with what people? And on and on and on and on and on. Then you're really on to going beyond the diagnosis. Then you can calm down saying, everybody thinks he has ADHD, but I know it might be more complicated than that. So you want to find a DIR clinician immediately, right? So that you can figure out. Sometimes kids can take all the information in, but they can't process it. So that would be like a learning disability. Your visual processing is off, but your auditory processing is on. Maybe that's something that you will learn. Because the minute you learn that, like I always use when I teach this, the example of auditory processing. I kind of speak loud, I kind of speak fast. When I get excited, I get louder and faster. That's just me. But if I see a kid I know has auditory processing problems, or I suspect, I fool around with it. I get real slow. I talk so calmly. And then I notice he understood me that way. She got what I was saying. Now I'm going to speed up. Now I'm going to get loud and excited. Now I'm going to get my, thing rolling. Didn't get it. So I have a lot of little data points like that. And then you see the connection is real when I slow the auditory transcript down, so to speak, right? So you can investigate the eye and have a lot of fun while you're doing it. So really, if you stop to think of what the diagnostic dilemma is, it's as follows. Think of yourself or your child as a triangle sitting in a bucket of grape jelly, or murky water. And you can only see what's above the water line. That's the only thing you have. What you might see is a kid who is called naughty. You might have a kid that is underachieving, showing a lot of anxiety, appearing to have attention problems. anger problems. Maybe you notice the kid is argumentative. That's all you have to go on. But what you see below the water level, what you can't see is below that water level, and that's where you do the investigation. I think another rule of thumb that I use, and certainly a lot of the clinicians that I know, and I'm lucky enough to work with some psychiatrists who belong to this this school of thought, is if you look at that triangle, of course, all you see is above, but what you see below, look at the bottom of that triangle and try to fix what's on the bottom layer. Then everything kind of gets better. What is on that bottom layer is usually mood or sensory processing. If you can get mood stabilized, often you can then see, oh my gosh, there's an attention problem. So think of it this way. I know so many cases like this. Child looks ADHD. So you give him a psychostimulant or you treat him medically. Nothing works. Just didn't work. Or you think, well, he's not ADHD because the Ritalin didn't work. Then you stabilize his mood, and all of a sudden the attention problems are so obvious because the mood got good and stable. He was no longer very anxious or depressed, but now, oh my gosh, you can't pay attention. So sometimes clarifying the mood gets you to see what else is going on. So sometimes it goes like this. Psychostimulant didn't work. Mood stabilizing worked. Now you can take the mood stabilizer away and give him the Ritalin again, and the Ritalin works this time. You know, so I've seen that over and over and over again. So it's okay to be confused. It's okay to know that this is going to take a very, very long time to figure out, but we're going to work by looking at those developmental capacities and getting that first one especially quite stabilized, get that ability to stay calm and feel good. Think about what we do in DIR. Sometimes we get a little criticized for it because when we don't want to put a lot of pressure on a kid until we have, or ever, but what we want to do is have a really good relationship with them. Then as a trusted friend, maybe you can say to this kid, I think we ought to look at this. If they trust you, then you can do stuff. But if you don't spend the time getting that relationship, you might as well forget it, right? Think of yourself when you learned how to ride a bike. You didn't learn to ride a bike when a complete stranger said, no, go ahead, I've got you. I'm taking the training wheels off. You did it because your mom or your dad or your big brother or sister or somebody you loved and trusted said, I got your back on this one. I'm not gonna let you fall. Then you go like, okay, I can ride a bike now. It's again an opportunity we don't want to steal from kids, but you can't give them the opportunity till you have a good relationship. It's just the same with adults looking at, I wonder if I have autism. I wonder if I'm on the spectrum. I wonder if that's what my kid got from me. Well, maybe they didn't get autism from you, but maybe they got your nervous system, and maybe your nervous system, maybe a part of your nervous system is what is making your child look autistic. And going beyond the diagnosis is kind of like the most important thing to do. Just saying that's diagnostic, you've got, that doesn't really help. It's like, this is hard for you, this is easy for you. You can, you can feel yourself going backwards from what might be a diagnosis. So sometimes in my office, I think I give diagnoses and I take diagnoses away in a ratio of 1-to-1. For every diagnosis that I seem to give, I seem to take one away. I give one to somebody and I take it away from somebody else. But that's my world in the office. But parents live in a world at home. So they often have incredible amounts of information that I don't have. And so that's why we can't do this alone. As a clinician, I can't do it in the office, but I can play and get a relationship in the office while I continue to ask parents, give me this information, give me this information. They know every context, every relative, every teacher, every situation. They know everything. And I know in my office or during a Zoom call or in your house for that 1 hour when everybody was on their best behavior, I don't have much data. So that's why another part of the model where we consider parents the cornerstones, it couldn't be more true than when you're trying to get diagnostic clarity.
Yeah, and a few things I thought of while you were speaking. one is that there are a lot of families that think or know that there's no incidences of diagnoses of any kind in the family, yet the child has. And perhaps there are undiagnosed people in the family. That's a possibility. But it could be that for some reason this is the first time this has come up in a large family. So what would you say to them?
Well, absolutely. It happens a lot. And, you think of your own family, right? I come from an anxious family. And nobody thinks anxiety is anxiety because everybody's got exactly the same, right? So Thanksgiving dinner with my extended family is hilarious because somebody's got OCD, somebody's got anxiety, somebody's, all the different, but nobody thinks anything's abnormal. If somebody says, we better check that stove for the 5th time to see if we turn the oven off, it's like, sure, all right, let's just do it. But when you get invited to someone else's house for Thanksgiving, you can stand out like a sore thumb. Yeah, so it's just what you get used to. And everything is an interaction between the world and your nervous system. So everything is, so sometimes the world has changed, think of, I don't know if you're familiar with Yuri Bronfenbrenner's social ecological systems where, there are like 5 concentric circles and the one is the individual and then it's the family and then it's the community and then it's the culture basically. And so we say the child in the family, and then you write school, neighborhood, friends, clubs, and then out there it's like cultural values, medical systems, laws. But somebody redid it because of the internet, and it's got the 5 concentric circles, and everything says the internet, the internet, the internet, the internet. That's a real changer, and that makes people look like they've got diagnoses. It causes the worst stress in the world. How many of us are not aware of video addiction, right? And how many of us realize that we are in the midst of, hopefully, knock on wood, coming out of a big cultural, worldwide cultural devastating pandemic. It changed us. It gave more of us diagnoses. It took some diagnoses away for some kids. From my perspective, some children inexplicably flourished during the pandemic and all these Zoom calls that we did with each other. It's the minority. But again, all these things happen to us. So sometimes when somebody's like the first person in the family to get formally diagnosed with, it can come out of the blue, by the way. It can come from a prenatal insult. All these things seem to correlate with that kind of thing. But again, it's you have to be comfortable with not knowing, and also not take away not invalidate the situation for the person with a diagnosis. Well, nobody in our family has, that kind of thing. You don't want to put that kind of pressure on an individual. You want to say, this is who you are, and this is who we are, and this is what we share and what we don't share. And you got diagnosed, and your cousin didn't, and that's okay. But it's really hard and it's really confusing. Daria, you're making me laugh because there is, anytime, it's certainly true with my own children, but anytime we see a problem with a particular kid, moms and dads have to figure out, that was my family, that was your family, right? It's like a parlor game almost, right? Whose nervous system did he get? There's an excitement about it, but there's also a little bit of a blame thing about it and a little validation about it too. It's really complicated.
Or the mix of certain things from one, certain things from the other. Right. And right. Yeah.
Right.
You really made me think of something Virginia Spielman said in a podcast we did a few years ago, which I can relate to as a former college radio DJ, the Vuzi Meter. So if you have a big mixing board sound where you're going to play music from analog, back in the analog days. So the diagnosis to me, I'm thinking is like turning on the machine, like it's on or off. Yeah. But really the most important thing is, where are all the different meters? So here's the level of this, here's the level of this, here's the level of this. So this one's low, this one's high, this one's normal, this one's normal, this one's normal, this one's low, this one's high. And then we're saying and you can adjust it in the booth to make it just right. Yeah, and situationally that impacts everything too. So it's we've heard this on other podcasts I've done too. Like it don't focus on the diagnosis so much as exactly what you're saying. Like what certain individual differences do you have? When does this happen? In which situations with which people, et cetera, so that you really have an individual profile for each child. And what I'm thinking in terms of what that would or wouldn't do for a parent to know if they have a diagnosis is more just for getting support in the areas that
Yes.
they have struggles with, which they may not have known until they have a child and have to deal with certain things that they didn't know were going to be hard for them.
Boy, that is such a profound point. Sometimes parents don't realize that they have more control over their environment than children do. I can choose to go to the grocery store at 10 p.m. because it's not crowded, for example. But a child has to go to school and show up at this time and sit carefully, no argument. Sit carefully, sit quietly, no argument. You have to do it. So sometimes I sometimes say to adolescents, especially when they get toward the end of their high school career, this is probably the last book report you have to write. This is probably the last time you have to deal with a subject matter that you could care less about. In college, if you go to university, you can pick the courses you take. If you choose a profession, you choose the profession. It gives you more degrees of freedom than you ever thought possible. And so that's why sometimes parents don't get the struggle that their kids are going through, is because they have more control over their environment than kids do.
With just a quick aside, that would be a whole separate podcast that I don't want to get into because it's so, what's the word, contentious. But
Yeah.
Adults have so much more freedoms, especially if you're white and privileged
Tell me about
and
it.
heterosexual and et cetera, et cetera. So that's a whole other thing that society's been dealing with during the pandemic, which I think is good. We're talking about lots of other
Oh my gosh.
constraints that are
Yeah.
on adults that
Right.
don't have the same opportunities as everybody else. But we understand that as a separate issue. In general, Kathy's saying, like, at least if you're an adult and you know you have the option to choose to go to the grocery store at a time where you're not as stressed out, we can put those in place, but we might need a coach to do that. I'll just give you one example, Kathy. Like, I find myself so on top of certain things all the time. Like, no problem, stay on top of this, stay on top of that. I cannot for the life of me plan dinner. Every day, it's like, oh no, I'm starving and I didn't think about this. And now I have to eat because now it's going to be, I have to do this and then I have to get my son ready for bed. But
Yeah.
I don't have time to plan now. And you'd think at my age by now, I'd have figured out that I should plan in advance to get my dinner organized. And luckily, on the days that my husband's organized, he's a wonderful cook and he does most of the cooking. But simple things like that.
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe I just need a coach. Mike Fields talked about his coach that he works with who helps him with things. Maybe a coach would say to me, like, here's a way that is easy for you, because I can't stand worksheets and like planning schedules and like I can't stand that kind of stuff. So what's a way that would work for me that would make it easier for me to know that dinner is planned every day? That's just a side example. I don't expect you to answer my personal problem, but just as an example.
Yeah, no, I know someone who said he is time organized like crazy. He can tell you the exact minute you're going to receive a report. But on the other hand, he is visually spatially impaired, and his wife has the exact opposite. So he said, when we meet up at one of us is at the wrong corner at the right time, and one of us is at the right corner at the wrong time. Hardly ever run into her. It's like, so yes, a coach is helpful, but self-acceptance is also, I know you, Daria, and I know that you also are very zen and cool about that's who you are, which brings up another issue here, is validating who you are. Your point about some people have different advantages than others is to me it's a gift of it's okay to acknowledge that. And and to learn about it. And to, don't assume don't believe everything you think is the way I kind of code that. But this validation of, so if I could pan this camera around, I'm sure I look kind of organized. There are more scraps of paper on my desk because I am an inveterate list maker. Notice I'm a maker, not a reader of my lists. So I am always struck with how calming that is for me. It has taken me years to accept the fact that the way I organize is to write it down. That is not how I execute. I don't go into the check. It doesn't make me feel good to put a check next to things. I thought there was something wrong with me. It never worked. And yet if I didn't write the list, it really didn't work. So for me, the acknowledgement that that's who I am, embrace it and go forward, laugh at yourself a little bit or a lot, and clean up and realize that when you clean your desk, that's an invitation to be not organized for the next few days because my desk looks good. It's really been a hard journey for me to do that. So we have to know what our strengths and our challenges are and not hate the challenges. We've got to love those challenges. We have got to embrace them and take a ride with them and validate them and model for our children that we can validate our peculiarities, our quirkiness, our whatever, our solutions. Because if we don't live in a world that lets us be self-advocates, we might as well just, go home because it's over. So one of the gifts of people saying who they are and living their truths and coming out of various dark corners is that they can validate and self-validate and be proud. And it is one of the most humbling, important experiences when clients teach me every day how to accept and validate themselves. And I realize sometimes privately, I don't do that for myself. And sometimes I'm in awe. I'm in awe. And part of that is because of things like DIR models that say relationships come first, calmness comes first, self-acceptance comes first. And if you really look at the developmental levels of the FEDCs all the way up to 16, you can look and every one of them has more self-knowledge and more self-knowledge and more self-knowledge. And it's quite inspirational. And it turns into knowing yourself, into helping society. And so that's why I love it. That's why I'm completely hooked on it. Any experience is good if it helps you know yourself a little bit better.
And what I hear is celebrate individual differences, celebrate individual differences. And that's one of the big cornerstones of a DIR model that differentiates us from other models, is celebrating those individual differences. And to me, that's really been a theme of the pandemic. One of the positives, we're seeing a lot of this, celebrating individual differences. And we're seeing a lot of people scared and not liking it at all. And we won't go into what that says about them because maybe, they need to delve in and understand why. But I think, yeah, like what you said is so important for us to be able to understand ourselves, helps us understand our children and empathize with our children and accept our children and really be able to support them.
Right. Exactly. And calm down about it, so to speak. Right. Yeah. Any experience that helps you know yourself a little bit better is good. And then you can be nice to yourself. You can take yourself seriously, or you can take yourself very lightly after that. And kids need that as a model. We all need that as a model.
Yeah. And what better note than that to end today's podcast on? Really, really awesome discussion. Thank you so much, Kathy. I think I hope this helps parents struggling with this identity issue or whatever, just to really, again, think about what are your strengths, what are your challenges. Let's work with those strengths. Let's accept our challenges, just like we aim to do with our children, no matter their diagnosis.
Correct. And Daria, let me just take this moment to thank you from the bottom of my heart. We have so many followers at Floor Time Atlanta of the Daria Brown in Affect Autism. You have done so much for this community. I cannot tell you. It's just great.
Wow,
So
thank you.
Thank you for using your particular superpowers in the direction of making life better for children and adults with developmental wrinkles. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I just aim to bring what I know to everybody else and try and match up what I think other people are looking for.
Thank you.
It's fun. I do enjoy it. So thank you.
Okay,
Um,
great.
and thanks so much again, Kathy, for listeners that want to read about what you heard. I have a blog post up at affectautism.com. I'll put links to some of the past podcasts we referred to and some of the theories and other names that Kathy mentioned. So check that out at affectautism.com. Thanks a lot, Kathy.
Thank you, Daria.
Get 15% off any DIR 101 course, An Introduction to DIR and DIR Floor Time through icdl.com by using the promo code AFFECTA15. That's AFFECTA15. Until next time, here's to affecting autism through playful interactions.